just want to talk really quickly about kind of my overall thoughts on how I went about selecting pieces for the show. So my main goal, going in was just wanting to show as wide a variety of the ways contemporary artists are using printmaking as possible. And whether that's from creating very traditional editioned prints on paper to almost more sculptural works, works on different types of mediums, or using experimental techniques. And so I just wanted to put that variety on display. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started talking about some of these prints today. We're gonna go through each of the prints just briefly, talk about them a bit, and there we go. So we're gonna start over here. First print we have here from Jessie Baggett is a woodcut. To me it looks like a reductive woodcut, so multi-layer, possibly probably all cut from the same block. One of the things that attracted me about this print was one, just kind of like this story I think is really interesting. It's kind of a sweet little moment. And then also technically, again, this kind of a multicolor woodcut process is definitely a challenging technique, and one that I think you get a lot from it, like that, going through that process of doing the reduction cuts, you get a lot from that. Our next piece here is Wesley Kramer, and it's called Ritual Sacrifice for the Queen. I've seen that Wesley has two prints in this show, and they both have these kind of really interesting, fantastical stories, which are really kind of engaging and draw you into the print, along with these really vibrant color palette, this kind of neon pinks and yellows. And so they're just really, they draw you in, and you're like, who is this queen? What am I doing? And this is a combo print, lithograph and screen print. That's another thing that really interests me in general about a lot of different prints, is combining multiple techniques together. Each technique has its own advantages and disadvantages, and so pulling the strengths of each of those together makes for a really successful print. So in this one, for example, you have the lithograph is all the black drawn imagery, which lithography is great. I think of it as kind of like, it's the most drawing-like print medium, because you literally are just drawing on the stone or plate. And then the color screen print, which screen print is great for just like big flat washes of color. Ooh, this is great. Okay, so our next cluster here, these are all relief prints in black and white. We've got Jim Weaver here. Jim's print process is a little bit different than some of your other relief techniques. Jim uses leather and kind of uses his leather carving, decorating tools to create a plate from a thick piece of leather, and then inks it up like you would a wood block or a lino cut, and prints that way. And I find this kind of process really fascinating, and one of the things I wanted to include that was showing something that people don't usually use as a traditional printmaking matrix, but it works beautifully for that. I really like the way this is framed. I like the black, kind of the gray matte. I think it makes a really impressive presentation. And all the texture, like the cleanliness of the paper, amazing. So much so that you see the beautiful textures within the print, and then also you're drawn to the textures of the paper itself, which, as somebody who really loves paper, I like to see the textures and weaves of the paper as well. These here we have Breadcrumbs Ink, which I believe is a collaborative team. They print together. And I've seen the kind of full-sized woodblock from this. This is from a series of kind of illustrative wood blocks, kind of all this whole story. And so there's this poker game going on. And again, I just love the textural kind of quality of wood carving. And you see that really well, like you working with the grain of the wood here, and it's really kind of expressive and illustrative.
I like the perspective of that one. I remember the first time I saw it, I was like, oh, the image it's just got squished, but then I looked closer at it and I was like, oh, this is actually from this point of view.
Yeah.
It's different. It wasn't just like straight on.
Right, it moves you down. You want to be like at the table level looking at it like that. Yeah, it really is kind of transporting you to that space. Up here we have a piece by Rob Smith. I believe Rob has 2 of these kind of B pieces in the show. And they're both, again, another just like, I really love this really kind of just expressive mark making in the backgrounds. I think it gives it a lot of energy. And to me, it's just kind of like a quintessential woodcut. Just almost simple, to the point. You just get the texture and the mark making. And also, I mean, just conceptually, bees and pollinators in general is something I've been thinking a lot about, and I think a lot of people have, so it's kind of very relevant in this moment to focus on these creatures, which are so very important to our food and our most things in our little world. So
I'm curious if you could talk about why you selected both of his pieces.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. I think that was a personal thing. Like, I really am really interested in my own personal work. I've been working a lot with themes about ecology and specifically pollinator ecosystems. So that's something that definitely attracted me to both of these works, and so I think it's an important issue. So I think that was what kind of drew me to bring those in. Yeah.
Got it. Cool.
This piece is by Kathleen Blake for The Love of Ink. And I think initially the thing that drew me to this most is, like, as a printmaker, a print about prints is just, I don't know, it just hits a little sweet spot for me. So I also think it's really just kind of really beautiful colors. I love this kind of very muted, complementary color palette. I think that works really well. I like a lot this kind of broken vertical composition. And it's just like a lovely rendered, but also abstraction combined. And so I like seeing those two things again together, kind of working with multiple mediums. We've got some sheen collé, some monotype, some drawing. So this really is a mixed media work as much as it is a print work, which to me, I think that's the direction printmaking in general is going, is away from what might be kind of your more traditional edition prints and towards using print as a tool in whatever other kind of work, your mixed media work you're making. Next piece is by Ariana Weir, and it's called Kitchen Table. Again, the thing I think that drew me most to this is this really interesting way that she's treated the wood grain in this. And just instead of, again, like you can use in a woodcut, this is a lino cut, but you can use the wood itself to create your wood grain. But she has so interestingly created this abstract pattern of the wood grain, which really grounds this whole piece. And so it's just a great contrast when all these little textures, the textures of the wood, the textures within the bottle, and how the kind of glass alters that pattern a little bit more. So that kind of really drew me into this piece, and it's simple, but kind of still arresting in that way. The next piece we have is by Katherine Prose. It's called Koala on Fire. So the two things that kind of struck me most about this piece were initially, I really like this color palette. I love using toned paper, like not starting from white, which I think is really interesting and doesn't happen as often as expected in printmaking. So I like that. I think it kind of makes it stand out in that way. And then combined again with a pretty limited but effective color palette using those complementary colors. And then again, as somebody who's really interested in environmental issues, this kind of reference to the wildfires in Australia and in general just kind of like what seems like pollution or different references to environmental issues. Something that drew me to this print. Also the format, which again, this is kind of a unique format, we get to the rectangle, these really regular rectangles and squares often, but this really long drawn out horizontal format was really interesting and perfect for a landscape, obviously, but I think that drew me to that print as well. Over here we have Jean Longo, it's called House Guest. The thing about this print that I thought was really interesting was the use of the looks like kind of an old map as your printing substrate instead of, again, traditional printmaking paper. And that to me hits on a couple different things. I think about birds, I think about migratory patterns, and maps and home, which kind of, to me, this is a little bit about home and migration. All right, our next print is by Virginia Sites. It's called My Hat. I am familiar with a lot of Virginia's work, but the thing about this piece that stood out to me was this somewhat more subdued, kind of moody color palette. Her work tends to be really vibrant and colorful, and so I thought this was a kind of an interesting change from what a lot of her paintings are, which are really bright. And I think there's something about printmaking that, you know, usually tends towards like a softer palette, and I really love this color combination.
Can you talk about how, as a juror, like when you know or are familiar with the artist's work, I've heard jurors say like it actually makes me harder on them because I expect more from them.
Yeah.
But can you just talk about that? I mean, even as you go, just like your thought process on that and being familiar with an artist's work versus being completely unfamiliar with them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and that's true. That's true of, I think, several people in this show. Is kind of like printmaking is a small community, particularly in this city and state. So a lot of us do know each other. And so with this case in particular, like to me, this is a really interesting direction that I don't think Virginia like leans towards as much. And so to me, and like, it's kind of me encouraging her, like, I think this is an interesting direction to look into. And it was very different from her other two submissions. And so kind of to me, it's like, saying like, this is something that I think is interesting, maybe explore it.
Yeah, awesome.
Okay, so next piece is by Katherine Liontas Warne. It's called Morphed Waves of the Sea. This was a piece that received a Merit Award. It's, as you can see, kind of a large format lino cut. And of course, the first thing that kind of stands out is the scale. Again, in printmaking, you can see it in this room. It's like it tends to be much more compact because of the methods that we work in. Like they're very labor intensive, and if you're working, the materials can get expensive, particularly if you're talking about etching or even lithography, like prohibitively expensive or just impractical. And so seeing a print of this scale is always draws you in and kind of lets you investigate a little bit further. And to me, the thing that it just is a wonderful composition. Again, the simplicity of just like black and white, but still very kind of captivating. I love this really delicate line work here and the different textures and kind of how those kind of morph together to still create, like you still see the wave. So I like this kind of gray area between abstraction and representational work. And so that's something that really interests me, is kind of like merging those two things together. Okay, so this is Jessie Warne, called R2. And this piece is letterpress. So again, using all these different elements from letterpress printing to kind of not create text per se, although yeah, it is still a letter, but in a totally, not the traditional way you would use letterpress printing. And so to me, that was kind of, again, like my interest in putting this show together was to show as wide a variety of types of prints and way that people are using printmaking as possible. And so to me, that's, again, just a kind of unique way to take things that in some hands are already created, like some of this woodblock type, right? It's already done, it's there for you, but how do you repurpose these other materials to create something that's totally different than what it had been used for before? Also, like this, I think we talked about this, but the framing of this is really nice. It's complements it really well and helps it stand out. Again, we tend towards black and white framing.
Yeah.
And so
I like it because it makes it look like something I would put in my house.
yeah, it does. It does. It makes it feel like you can see this in
Right.
your home, right? And I also think I like this reference of, again, you can see the grain of the wood in the wood blocks that were used to print it. And so whether that's an intentional choice or not, like the reflection of the materials you choose to frame that in are interesting too.
Yeah.
I've known a couple artists who really embrace like how to frame things, like even creating their own frames that mirror the work, and that's an interesting thing. We think about framing as kind of an afterthought sometimes, when in fact like it really can make or break how people are going to interact with the piece. So this piece here is called On Cue by Jolene Loyd Forbes. The thing that when I was looking through the slides, initially selecting pieces, that stuck out to me about this was this process, which is something I'd never heard of before. So it's a clay monotype on fabric. And again, it had prompted me to go and be like, what is a clay monotype? Like I had to go dig through YouTube and find some demonstrations of what this process was.
So you learned something.
Yeah, so I learned something, and that was something that, again, was really exciting to me, of like, people are using, again, an incredibly non-traditional, I mean, in terms of printmaking, material to create a print. And so that was the thing I was, really interested in seeing this piece in person. And one of the things I like about it, having seen it in person, is it's on fabric, and so you see kind of the fibers of the fabric interacting with the clay ink, we'll call it. And so that was something that is cool, interesting in that piece. All right, this piece is Stalemate by Alvarez. This is another piece that again combines multiple different print processes. So it's a combination reduction lino cut, you can see that in the figure, lithograph, which I imagine is that background piece, and watercolor. And
I believe it's not on the label, but I believe he also used an old map
okay.
to print on.
Cool.
And did not make it on the label.
That's fair.
I realize now.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I love as a hoarder myself, of like saving all these really interesting little scraps and bits of paper and this and that. And how do you use that kind of information? How does that affect the work you're making? Like really thinking about what does that object that I'm incorporating to my work mean? And so like in that other piece that used that map, like you go to very specific references when you see that stuff. I also really love the treatment of the figure here and kind of this little stippling technique, which is something I haven't seen a lot of kind of in a lino cut like this, and so that was really interesting to me. Yeah, and again, just not feeling like you need to stick to just one technique or even just one just printmaking to create something. Like this beautiful like watercolor background is such an interesting contrast to this really highly detailed rendered part of the figure, and so I think that's a really interesting thing to combine those media. So this next piece it's called Visionary by Lissie Teehee, and this is a solar print relief on fabric, and you can see it's kind of see the outline of where the block is, and it's printed multiple times. So one, I was very impressed, registering something like this, particularly on what looks like fairly heavy duty fabric, is probably pretty challenging. Printing on fabric can be hard when it's something you have to run through a press. And so that was kind of, again, technique and materials are what initially attracted me to this piece. And then also, I love this idea of kind of the infinite print, like this could be printed back to back to back to back to back to cover this entire wall. And I think that's, again, that speaks exactly to the strength of printmaking, which is its reproducibility. Whether, in whatever way you want to do that, whether that's 15 of the same prints, or something that fills an entire space, or there's just so many different ways you can use that element of printmaking to your advantage. All right, so our next piece, this is by Jenn Johnson. It's called Body Collage, Triple Impression. It's a lithograph. It looks like a like plate lithograph, a photolitho. And I was really interested, again, in kind of these multiple triple impressions, we'll say. The layering, but without this kind of, but in a different way than some of the prints where you're kind of layering to create one very tightly rendered image. This is kind of layering different textures and images on top of each other. Still using representational imagery, but kind of abstracting it just by layering. Yeah, so that was the thing that I found really interesting about this print, and color also. I like this limited, kind of muted color palette, but that still gives you that sense of kind of the mood. This other piece is also by Jenn Johnson and received an honorable mention, called Body Collage Mirrored Male. This piece is an etching, and again, I'm not exactly certain, but it looks to me like a process called open bite, possibly, which is where you take your metal plate, copper or steel, whatever you're using, and blocking out some parts of the plate, but kind of dip it in your corrosive bath and just like let, you know, the acid do its thing. The salts, probably in this case, or nitric acid. And so you kind of get these somewhat unexpected patterns and textures. Again, this is conjecture. I think this is the process that was used here. That's what it kind of reminds me of. But either way, the thing about this piece that really interested me is this really deep, contrasty texture, and but also, again, still this as in this piece too, kind of like bringing together representational, like with the figure, and this really abstract, kind of gritty texture. This is called Little Cloud by Leah Pappan. It's a mono print, and the thing I think that attracted me most to this is I love these colors. I love this kind of simple color palette, but again, very attractive. And the format, like this, kind of the other really long horizontal piece, breaking out of this kind of regular rectangle is interesting, and perfect for a piece like this that wants to draw you up into the sky. So use that composition to draw you up into this beautiful expanse of sky. And I love this little kind of, the idea of like tying your cloud to a string. It's a really sweet idea. Okay, so here we have, this is Central Mountain in Oklahoma by Katherine Prose. It's a lithograph, multicolor lithograph. The thing that struck me most about this initially was, again, breaking that rectangular format, using the circle as the base of your image. That's something I'm really interested in general, in my own work. I love circles everywhere. And so again, the repetition of this circle over and over in the overall composition, and in these little gray circles that pop out throughout. And again, it's something that really intrigues me, like looking in at all these little characters. This woman riding a lion and the birds, and there's a lot of small details that can draw you into this landscape that you kind of want to investigate. The other thing that is interesting that I didn't realize until I saw it in person was that it was printed at the Tamarind Institute. And the Tamarind Institute is like a world famous lithography shop in New Mexico. And this is, another thing that impressed me about this was the quality of the printing, and so I can see definitely the correlation between working in that shop, having printing it in that shop, and that quality really comes through. So this is called Grand Voyage by Wesley Kramer. We talked briefly about one of Wesley's other pieces, but the thing that draws me immediately to Wesley's work is just this vibrant colors, this fantastical story that I'm trying to read through the piece, and scale. Another thing about, like, maybe this isn't that large for a painting, but for a print, this is a large print. It's a woodcut, etching, and screen print, and so this was a difference that I noticed much more dramatically in person. Was the base looks like the woodcut, and you have these little kind of collaged elements of the other pieces. Like here, the little pizza is an etching. And so you just kind of have this little surprise of this whole new technique and a kind of a much finer line quality, which is characteristic of etching, in the midst of this really riotous, kind of expressive woodcut. And this is another piece that received an honorable mention. All right, so our next piece is called Three Vines by Carol Webster. This piece is, again, another unique type of printmaking. It's an eco print, so you are using plant material essentially as your ink and running it through the press. So I wanted to include this piece specifically for that reason, because it's a type of monotype essentially, but outside of the kind of traditional etchings, lithographs, woodcuts. And so I really wanted to include this kind of very different type, whole new category of printmaking. I also really like how she framed this. Again, kind of like that woodcut piece earlier. There's like a really specific reference between subject matter and kind of framing treatment that was working really well, and also just so perfectly picking up these kind of gray brown tones in that is really working for me. All right, so our next piece is called Sting 2 by Sherry Klechka. This piece, she's calling it a nature print. The way this was made was literally using a piece of what it looked like beehive or maybe wasp, and putting ink on it and using that to make your impression, to make your print. And similar to Carol Webster's piece, this is a really non-traditional way to interpret printmaking, and so that's why I wanted to include this piece in the show.
I like that it's really accessible. It's taking the scary, I have to have a press, I have to have all these tools. I can just like use things found in nature. This is a print made out of something, a natural texture.
Yeah, definitely. And there are a lot of artists doing really interesting things, like taking impressions of trees, or inking up manhole covers, or like there's a lot of different ways to kind of take printmaking outside of your print studio, and that's something that's really interesting and kind of exciting about the direction this medium can go. The next piece is called Wild West by Justin Stier, and this is a 4-color etching with aquatint, and there's 2 pieces in this show that have this kind of incredibly traditional method. And so you're creating multiple, probably copper plates, doing your designs, etching them in your acid or ferric chloride bath to create these really kind of soft, gradual textures and washes of color. I think the area that I like the most is kind of here, where all those 4 different colors come together. but don't just like gray each other out. They kind of create this really soft, beautiful environment in which this character is like, you know, throwing his, oh God, what are those called? Plungers. They're plunger. It's plunger gun. So I wanted to include a couple of these like very traditional types of printmaking, whether, you know, the imagery isn't necessarily like, you know, like Albert Dürer, but the techniques are similar. So this next piece is Annalisa Campbell. It's called Who Told You That? I included this piece because, again, one, I like his composition. Again, a really nice, simple composition, but that's very effective. And also for process, it's kitchen lithography, which is, again, a process you can do in your kitchen. It's very accessible. You don't need as many, you don't need litho stones, you don't need that crazy printing press. I believe this process is also called, or similar to, like a Xerox copy transfer. And so you're using material printed out on a toner-based printer or drawn with specific materials on, again, just a regular piece of paper, and then using gum arabic to help ink attract only to those places where you have the toner or have that other crayon drawn, and then you can put ink on it and print like that. And so I think this is a fascinating process. I also think it's really interesting the way she framed it. So there's 3 little nails in each of these 3 corners that's holding the piece up off the glass, and behind it is a piece of cardboard. And so to me, it's kind of just like a little irreverent of all these, like, we're constantly told like, this has to be acid free, this has to be this, like all these rules that I don't like to follow, and I think it's fine if people don't follow them. And so it's just kind of acknowledgement of like, who needs it? Like, the cardboard color works really well, picking up these little washes of color she's got throughout, and so it fits really well with that, and I like that. All right, so our next piece is by Samantha Kickingbird. It's called Campanion. This is a 4-color etching and aqua tint with sheen collé. And to look closer at this, where the sheen collé? Oh yeah, okay. So again, a very traditional method of printmaking, using, again, multiple metal plates to create a highly rendered image. To me, I really loved, again, the composition, these kind of slightly stylized figures. The colors are really, again, subtle and subdued, but still, again, effective, creating this kind of mood. And also sheen collé, like a really, again, very subtle use of that, which you kind of can pick up in some of the colors of the dog here. And it's very subtle. It's through the whole space, but I think it does something. It gives you a 5th color, which I think is something we forget about sometimes. It's how important the color of the paper is to your print, or papers if you're using multiple. And how that is an extra little tool you can use to add a different texture or color in printmaking, which can be very restrictive color-wise. So this piece is Liza Terrell. It's called Overwhelmed. This piece is again something that definitely a mixed media piece. She's combining a lot of different techniques. Intaglio, steel plate etching, charcoal. So again, your kind of more traditional etching techniques, but then cut out and kind of collaged together, and then with the really kind of expressive charcoal drawing on top. This piece, I mean, I really like this piece a lot. I think the composition is really interesting. Like, I have these kind of references to like arms and legs maybe. So there's like this weird tense energy, and I also love this subtle kind of neutral toned color palette. but still with a lot of contrast. And yeah, I think it just is really, it pulls you in to kind of look at all these different textures, and is just a very gestural abstract piece. The next piece in the show is called Random by Elizabeth Richards. This piece is another piece that's combining a lot of different crossing genres and mediums. So it's combining kind of quilting, shibori treatment of the fabric with letterpress printing. And letterpress is another one of those techniques that not a lot of people are using much these days. One, because it's pretty difficult to get access to. You need a different type of press than you do for all these other techniques. You need the type, which can be hit or miss to find. So it's something that was a reason I really wanted to include this piece, is another way of using these pre-fabricated letters, matrices, similar to the way her large kind of R abstraction did, to create something new from these kind of ancient, formerly utilitarian printing objects. All right, this next piece is called New World, New Probs by Summer Zaw. It's a screen print or serigraph. Those two words are basically interchangeable. And one thing I liked about this piece, again, technically we're using a lot of different colors, which requires lots of registration. So that's definitely a challenge, and it's done successfully here. I also love, it's just interesting. It's just kind of an exciting composition. I'm really intrigued by this kind of character that's being created here. Okay, so our next piece is the second piece by Rob Smith. And upon seeing this piece, I'm remembering more about my process of choosing both of the bees. So this bee is the queen bee. That is the worker bee of the same species. So to me, that was kind of, again, it's like a compare and contrast within that same species. And so they're almost like little, zoological studies of sorts. And I think I love this piece. I love the kind of more controlled, circular, but still very expressive mark making that he's got going on, kind of really centering the queen bee, right? Yeah. All right, so next piece is called Avoiding COVID-19 by Brian Ping. This is monotype, and then combined with, I think, colored pencil and pastel. And one, I was really interested in this, again, a really bright color palette, but still referencing, rendering a figure in these like neon oranges. And also, again, it just is very relevant to what we're doing right now. And I feel like it's something that a lot of artists and individuals can relate to as far as subject matter. I was really interested in all this background texture. I feel like that really puts you in the headspace of this, what's essentially a portrait. And so that was what drew me to this piece. Our next piece is by Isabella Kramer. It's called Seeing Color. It's intaglio and watercolor combined. So intaglio is, right, the big broad category of types of printmaking techniques, where you're printing, your ink is below the surface of the plate. And so intaglio is kind of an umbrella thing that can reference etching or dry point or sometimes collagraph. And so I'm not exactly sure whether this is like a copper etching or a dry point on aluminum. I was trying to investigate that earlier. One of the ways you can initially I was leaning towards thinking it was a dry point because of these really kind of expressive, almost sketch-like marks. But usually dry point has like a much rougher, fuzzier line, and these seem pretty sharp, so still up in the air about it. But to me it's just like transporting you right into someone's stream of conscious. Like that's how it felt to me. Like you're getting inside someone's sketchbook, inside someone's head. And so that's an interesting place to be, particularly in a medium that is so technical and time intensive. Like we often see very like meticulously calculated and planned prints, right? And this feels much looser and more expressive, and so that was something that interested me, like the contrast between that feeling of immediacy and what really takes actually a lot of time to produce. And so I think that's kind of an interesting contrast between those two. So our next piece is called An Intimate Distance by Ivan Alvarez, and this is a multicolor reductive woodcut. And I think we might have talked about this briefly before, but reductive prints are where you're using, so this multicolors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, how many colors, all came from one single wood block. And so you essentially cut the least amount first in your lightest color, probably yellow maybe here, and print that. And then you remove a little bit more and print your next color, remove a little bit more, print your next color. And so, this is a technique that, again, very time intensive and very little room for error. Like you can't go backwards. You're like, oh, I messed that one up. It's done forever. And so it's a technique I respect a lot for that reason. You definitely have to commit. And then besides that, I love this color combination. It kind of feels very, futuristic sci-fi in the color palette. And I'm also really interested in the title. Really drew me in and kind of gave me a lot of information about this, like thinking about how much of these really intimate relationships, particularly now with us all having to be so distant, is happening using technology, cell phones, whatever. And so the weird kind of navigating the intimate, but while simultaneously being very physically distanced. So it felt very relevant, and I think spurred a lot of thoughts. Okay. So our next piece is called The Virus Barbell by Suzanne Owens. It's a monotype. Again, I was interested. I think this piece also, I thought it had some pastel drawing on top. And so I was interested to see, again, just to see it in person and see how those textural contrasts were. And so just like this really soft, feathery quality of pastel, this really velvety feeling, and then combine that with print. I also like these, again, kind of complementary colors but off a notch. I think are some of the most successful color combinations. Like, I think we get a little, complementary colors are great, but it's so much nicer when you just move them off like 0.5 in either direction. You get like a much more complex and interesting color combination without having to stray too far from what you want. So our last piece is by Aztrid Moan. I wanted to include this piece, one, because I like, again, breaking out of this format, something a little non-traditional, and so thinking about using textiles as your printing base for, not just for textiles, for utilitarian purposes, but as art you can hang on your wall. And so that was the thing that initially attracted me most to this, was breaking that regular format and using kind a slightly non-traditional technique, I guess, on a fabric that looks like tie-dye to me too. So again, bringing in multiple across mediums together in the